confident and committed acceptance. One of those spiritual fruits that all of us can depend on from God for our new normals. So to get us thinking about that, come in. There we go. You don't get to say them both. You have to decide which one you're more of. All right? So which description fits you best as an individual? Are you someone who's more like A, I like some variety and I am okay with trying new things? Or maybe you're just overboard with that. You can't wait for the next new thing to come along. Or you're B, I like things to remain pretty much the same. And maybe you're even a little OCD. They gotta be the same or else. But if you had to choose to match yourself to one of those points, which of you would be A? Okay. How many of you would be B? All right, none of the above? All right, so we still got somebody who's non-committal. Can't wait to find out after class what you're like. So most of you raised your hands for A, so you must be coping and dealing with the new normal that we're living in fairly well. And maybe some of you in B are doing the same. Of course, what is not always accurate and what is not always dependable to say that you're the kind of individual that is flexible enough or stable enough or has the stability in your life to maintain things the way they are to be ready for something which is dramatically different. Especially when it becomes a spiritual issue, like many things are going to become for us. Then we have to realize that it's not all on us, but it's on God and us in that order. And that's one of the things that we learn about from Daniel, especially in the way that he needed to gain acceptance for what he was about to go through. And then also to have the commitment and the confidence in God that God was there for him, like all of us do. So let's take a look at the first section there, the first two verses of Daniel chapter 1. Follow along on those pages that are stapled for you or also up here. We're told that in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he, Nebuchadnezzar, carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Note that even though Jerusalem was besieged and Nebuchadnezzar carried off some of the plunder, Jerusalem wasn't destroyed. Nor did the kingdom of Judah end at this point. And so in a sense, things weren't maybe as bad as they could have been for the people at this time. Kind of to set the scene, take a look at the next slide. So if you look at the timeline, the kingdom of Judah was around. What had happened to the kingdom of Israel? It had disappeared 100 years before this. The people before the Babylonians, the Assyrians invaded and carried off those northern 10 tribes. And then they even surrounded Jerusalem, but remember, Hezekiah was delivered by God, and the kingdom and the city continued on. As most people, most Jews expected it to, because God said, "You're my people, this is my kingdom, this is where the Messiah is going to come from." It's got to go on. But now comes Nebuchadnezzar, and actually now the city is taken. And in 607, 606, that is when the Babylonian captivity, the exile as it's also referred to, that's when it started. That's when not only articles from the temple, but even some of the people were carried off into Babylon. Not as many at first, but many of them, like Daniel, were gone. And so now people are starting to think, is this going to end? Can it end? And actually, God had been saying, yeah, it's going to end. He had been saying this pretty clearly, especially through some of the prophets. You see them listed down there below. Daniel, of course, was one of the newer ones that was coming on the scene. Jeremiah had been at it for quite some time already. In fact, he had even said 70 years, and there's really not going to be anybody here. There's not going to be any kings here anymore, which took some getting used to. In fact, Jehoiakim, he took what Jeremiah wrote down and he burned it. He said, there's no way this is ever going to happen. And a lot of people went along with him. And then Ezekiel was one of those prophets that was carried off into exile, into Babylon, to let the people know there, yeah, this is actually happening. How could that happen? Because of God allowing the new kingdom of Babylonia to rise to power. Egypt had been a power, but they were kind of getting pushed away. On the scene were the Medes and the Persians out east. They were coming on the scene in 70 years, but right now King Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon were the people that God was allowing to take over. That is today's Iraq. And the reason they were able to do that is because of some of the weaponry that they had. So they had the cavalry, even ones who were armed with the bows and arrows. In the background there you see even some of the cavalry on camels. I'm not sure how effective they were. They had these large chariots that would carry as many as 4 people, so not just a person to drive it and a person with a spear, but one with a shield and possibly even with an archer. So they could actually crush some of the infantry that they were facing. And then what's not shown on there were some of the siege instruments that they had to bash through even some of the thick walls that other enemies might not have been able to get through, like the walls of Jerusalem. But what is of interest here is that we're told that articles from the temple were taken away. You think of some of those, some of the valuables, like the Ark of the Covenant, that small box that even had the 10 Commandments, those tablets of stone that Moses had received, and then also some of the other golden articles, the altar of showbread, the 7-stemmed lampstand, the altar of burnt incense. Those were valuable articles. They may well have been taken. Didn't necessarily happen like you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark that Pharaoh got them. They might have actually gone to Babylon. But of course, that was quite alarming. Even though the king was still around, even though the city was still there, even though the kingdom, so to speak, was still around, those articles in the temple weren't. Why would that have been so upsetting for God's people? If you don't have the Ark of the Covenant, that symbolized mercy seat, the most holy place. That's where God was. If you didn't see him, and most of the time you didn't, it was a symbol that he was there. And with those gone, people started to think, is God with us? How do you come before a holy God? You offer up those sacrifices. Some of that blood is even sprinkled inside of the temple. With those articles gone, could those sacrifices be valid? Could you truly be at peace with God? Maybe God was truly bringing his punishment upon the people, and actually, that's exactly what was happening. Those articles symbolized to the people that God had departed from most of those people because they had become unbelievers in their wickedness and in their idolatry. It says that the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And in your study guide, point number 2, I said, realize the test that this would have given believers in Judah, the remnant, like young Daniel. With, in a sense, God departed from us, what was going to happen to us in our nation? Is our nation going to come to an end? And God said it was going to come to an end. And then, of course, what about the Messiah? And what about our being delivered from? What about our being able to handle all of these dramatic changes, even the evil that's coming on us? The test was to still trust God in a new way that God was bringing about for them and their country. In fact, one of the things that Ezekiel, that prophet, had already pictured at this time was God's glory departing from the temple. God was now showing visibly, in a sense, what God was doing for most of his people, really in a sense his nation, because they had become an ungodly nation, no longer really a nation of God's people. But at the same time, this is what Ezekiel said. You don't have this on your study guide, but it says, "Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, so Israel and now Judah, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone." God's sanctuary had been in the most holy place, on Mount Zion in the temple. God said his sanctuary continued to be in the hearts of that remnant, in the hearts of believers like Daniel. They had to trust that that was true, and they had to accept that God was going to rule and be with them in a different way, even though it wasn't the way that they had always thought it was going to be. Let's try applying that to some of the new normals that we're facing now, or maybe even worse to come. In fact, that's kind of what people are saying. We got a new president. You've got the same difficulties, maybe even worse, that we're going to be facing. Okay, you get to make a pick. Pick your poison, so to speak. The pandemic has been a major blow to our nation. What do you think the next crisis will be? Do you think it's going to be a major economic downturn? Some people are forecasting that, possibly with a new administration. Another crippling disease. They say that there are these other viruses, even some antibiotic-resistant diseases that are out there. Terrorism and international war. When's the next attack going to come? When's the next conflict that we're going to be involved in? Out-of-control civil violence. What if people do not accept the way things are and continue to demonstrate? Any prophets, any seers? Any concerns? I had somebody call me up yesterday and they asked me, what do you think is going to happen? We just bought a new house. I just got a good job, but all of that could be in jeopardy now, especially if we go into a recession. What am I going to do? What should I think? That's often the question, right? Or even if something personal happens to us where things dramatically change. Suddenly you're without a job, or suddenly you're without the income, or suddenly you're ill and everything changes. How do you handle that? How do you accept that? Yeah?
Personally, I just pray. Pray that, pray that there might be a change in the outcome. Pray that, I'm sure whatever happens, the Lord will be with me continuously, and hopefully my family.
Yeah. So petition as well as promises, right? You petition that your family, you are brought through it, but also a promise that you're going to in prayer that God is with you. Kind of actually brings us to the next question. What messages really are needed? What need to be heard by us and shared by us? So keep praying. Keep reminding ourselves that God is with us, that God is our deliverer. Any others that you would cling to, or that you'd really be looking to hear from your pastors or from your Lord as he leads you to search the Scriptures? Yeah?
Philippians
Julie pointed out, Philippians 4, rejoice, the Lord is near. So we should be glad that everything is happening the way it is. You didn't say that. You did say, rejoice that we can continue to pray, like the passage goes on to talk about. That rejoice that the Lord is near. Yeah, that must have been difficult for Daniel, right? How can God be with us when the prophet Ezekiel says he's departed from us? How can he be with me when I had this royal position, maybe even was part of God's dynasty, this kingly family that was supposed to carry on his will on earth, and now it looks like it's coming to an end? How can you be sure that God is going to deliver you in the way that you need to be delivered? What's your certainty? Al? Or something else?
Yeah, I'm not answering your question. Just continuing on this, the messages that need to be heard and shared have been for many months during this now about how, and it's the thing that I really have appreciated is that our church and other churches of people that I've spoken to have been sharing this message that, God is in charge, that we need to place it all, as we've just said, that we need not be anxious about it because it isn't our doing to worry about it. But whether it be the social unrest or the political divisions, whatever it is, that those kinds of messages that we're hearing need to be continued.
Because we tend to default to the way things were, or the way things we want them to be, which gives us stability, that gives us maybe a guarantee of good. And what's happened, we're displacing the foundation of God and whatever He wills with what we will, or what we think has to be, when God says it doesn't really have to be like that. And that's really the test for Daniel and his companions, to go along with what God was saying, which in a sense was new but also the same, even when things were dramatically changing. Like Psalm 46 reminded us last week, where the mountains are falling into the depths of the sea. What we're so used to is completely gone, and now we have to trust God in this new normal. We have to keep going to His messages. We have to keep going to the guidance that He gives to us, even in new times where He remains the same. But let's go on. Verse 3. Then the King Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. This wasn't just going on with Daniel and his companions, but this was going on throughout the empire. King Nebuchadnezzar was gobbling up a lot of territory. And he didn't necessarily have the people in place to govern those areas and keep them under control. So he needed a lot of good men quickly. And he was going to get them trained. He was going to recruit them from the farm clubs of these nations that he had conquered. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. So the brightest of the best, even the best looking. Some of the records that have been discovered about King Nebuchadnezzar's qualifications were that you not even have acne. You are not only going to be a good learner and administrator, but you better look good if you're going to be in the king's court. And be very healthy in order to carry out everything that he wanted you to do. Ashpenaz was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So a pretty steep learning curve. You got 3 years to acclimate yourself to a completely different language, possibly, and a new culture, and then to accept this new normal that you better know, and I suppose you better like, and then you better be ready to carry that out. In fact, you're even going to do it the King's way. You're going to get the food that he served himself, the best food, so that you have the brain food and everything else that you need to stay healthy and to learn as fast as you need to learn. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. So Daniel, whose name had a form of God in it, El. Actually, the others do too. They end with Ah, that's a form of Jehovah. So these names that were given to them as God's people. God is my judge. That's what Daniel means. He was given a name in honor of one of the gods of Babylonia now, the god Bel. Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. If you're a VeggieTale fan, that's Rack, Shack, and Benny. So they all received Babylonian names, and they were expected to become Babylonians. Put yourself in their shoes. Consider the emotions or thoughts you would have had as you were removed from your homes and families and taken into the custody of the Babylonian government. Probably people who were very young, in their teens. People who were from affluent families, either nobles or even in part of the king's family, from David's line. Now suddenly told that you were going to serve an idolatrous nation who had taken the treasures, even those sacred objects, from God's temple. What kind of emotions or thoughts might they have had? Yeah.
Anger?
Yeah. How can they be doing to us? Well, we're not going to serve them. Other emotions or thoughts they might have.
I have a different question. What if they turn ugly during that time? Like acne or are they kicked off to?
We're going to hear about that because Daniel, in a sense, kind of did get ugly. Not in appearance, but in following following the regulations. Yeah, you were out. I mean, there was this the few that were going to make it. What is it in the Marines or even some of those special services that we have? There's not too many that make it, and people were being weeded out certainly. What happened to them? I suppose you went back into the trenches, or went back with your people who were trying to eke out a living, possibly. Daniel maybe even had, and his companions, they must have struggled with a bitterness towards God. How can we accept what we're going through when this isn't the way it was supposed to be? Homesickness, right? A sadness, not being able to adjust. I mean, it's difficult enough to adjust to things that are so difficult, not seeing or being with the people that you so much treasure, and now suddenly having that ripped away, probably for the rest of your life. Imagine that. It's hard to imagine what they were going through. But they better be ready for what they were going to be going through. Yeah.
Our identity as Christians was on the line too, because they weren't New Testament Christians; these were Old Testament Christians. So they had the Sabbath day, circumcision, and the festivals. This is who they were as Christians, and now that was all kind of ripped away. And so holding on not just your customs, but your faith, that was all being taken away from them. So in a way that we would be that way. If we just moved to a different country, you could still be a New Testament Christian that way, but it's a real challenge to be an Old Testament Christian in Babylon.
God had said the Temple Mount was the place where he was going to be worshipped and where he would come to his people. What would they do now? It'd be like God saying, this is the place where it happens. For you to come close to me and for you to draw near to me. If you're no longer able to come here. I think sometimes we felt that way. If we're not in God's house, can we truly worship Him, and can He truly come to us and strengthen us in the way that we want Him to? Or if we can't gather with other people, or if we can't carry on our form of worship? But that's exactly what God had said to them, and now suddenly all that was being taken away from them. And then their identity. They were losing their identity. They had to completely start over. Imagine being that person that had lost their memory and couldn't remember a thing and had to start all over again. That's what Daniel and his companions were facing. How can you accept that? How can you go on like that? Only with the confidence and the commitment that God gives you to accept His new normal with Him in it. Think of some of the pressures that Daniel and his companions would have faced in their training. Imagine if you were told that you had to learn calculus looking at that. I got to advanced math in high school. Boy, I couldn't tackle calculus. Imagine trying to tackle calculus with a different language with different symbols. That's possibly one of the things that Daniel and his companions did. What that is one of those tablets with cuneiform on it. They didn't use that necessarily in Babylon. They used Aramaic, but there were those records like that they still may have used in order to mathematically chart the course of the stars and the planets. That was a big deal. In fact, Daniel, where he was going to ascend to, was the cabinet of the king. And you looked at the stars, astrology, in order to give the king guidance. So you better know your stuff. Daniel had a short period of time, like his companions did, that you better learn that language, and you better be better able to make those calculations, or else. A lot of pressure on them. Not just in adjusting or wondering how is God going to be with us and bless us, but now that they had those formidable new challenges ahead of them. Which maybe isn't too bad of a thing for us, because it leads us to realize, there's a lot of pressures that we can expect in new situations of life. Any examples that you can think of just how challenging, how much pressure there is to adjust? How do you go from being the person who drives everywhere and does everything on their own, and even their spouse is no longer around, to being told by your doctor that because of your failing sight, you might have to give up the car keys? Or being in that place where you always planned on being with your family, but now suddenly there's not a job for you anymore. In fact, you can't take your family along, but you got to go someplace else and work there while your family stays back. Or maybe not being able to come here for worship anymore, like some of our people have faced. Maybe you've experienced some of that. Maybe there's some of that to experience yet. And how do you hold up under the day-to-day pressures where the old norm is maybe completely gone? And what do you depend on then? How do you accept that? That's what God was doing for Daniel, and also what He continues to do for us. Let's go on there. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid, my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink, why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." You find out how patient, or how impatient King Nebuchadnezzar was, and how not understanding he would have been. Performance or else. His official Ashpenaz better better get these men whipped into shape, and he better make sure that they're getting the right thing to eat and to drink. You're not going to be drinking the water, right, and getting sick, getting diseased, passing it along to other people. You're not going to eat inferior food and not have what you need to perform the tasks that you need to do every day in order to get up to speed. But Daniel said, I'm going to defile myself, because what? Some of that is unclean, unkosher. It's the pork that God has forbidden us to eat. It's maybe even some of those foods that would have brought along with it, if not an association, even a worship of the false gods. Because as those foods were put on the king's table, they would have been offered up as a sacrifice to those false gods. Can I eat those same foods? What do you think? Agree or disagree? In this situation, it would have been a sin for Daniel to eat the unkosher food from the king's table. Remember, he's not back in Judah anymore. They don't have the temple worship anymore. It's a different situation. God has put him in a new place where he's got to, live up to the authorities that are telling him what to do. Would it have been okay? Or was this something that God was telling Daniel and the rest of his people, you're not going to defile yourself by eating unclean food? You weren't there, so how do you know? Nope, here we go.
I would say, disagree.
So-
I feel no matter where you are in life, you still need to honor the Lord,
Okay.
even if people around you aren't.
If God says something, you are going to honor him by obeying it. You're going to show your love for him by obeying it. Did God's law still apply to him way up there? What brought those laws to an end? Yeah. Those ceremonial laws of eating certain foods and refraining from others, that wouldn't come to an end until Jesus came along. They were still God's people. They still had his law, even though they didn't have his temple. They still had his word that they needed to listen to and obey. Daniel and his companions had that word. But now there was that pressure. If you don't eat, watch out, right? You might have that official's head, the king. You might also have yours. Now, you apply it to today. Think of how pressures, possibly from some of those new normals that we might face, can lead to rationalizing that certain sins may be acceptable. You're in a new relationship as a young person, or maybe even somebody who's older, and that person that you're in that relationship with doesn't have the same values as you. And so maybe you don't go all the way. You don't have sex, but maybe there is some sexual intimacy there. Maybe that's okay. It's not. Or you're in a new job, and there's a lot of pressure to perform, and maybe you've got to cut corners as far as honesty, or maybe sometimes your family isn't getting the part of you that they need to have. Do you give in to the pressures? Or do you follow what God says in taking care of the responsibilities that you need to take care of and being honest in the way that you need to? Or when you're facing some of the things that you never wanted to happen to yourself, you say, God, this can't be, and you just pray like mad that God, it can't be this way, right? Not your will, but my will be done. And we may not say exactly like that, but that may be kind of the way that we're praying. Do we cave into those pressures? It's easy to do that. And that's why we need the acceptance that God was working in Daniel, just like he does for us. In fact, Daniel's acceptance, I think, is sometimes referred to as gentleness. And Julie and the ladies from Philippians 4 will appreciate this. They've been studying the book of Philippians in their ladies group. Daniel had a gentleness that God gave him for this new normal. Philippians 4, verse 5, right after those verses that Julie had mentioned before, rejoice always. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. It's interesting interesting how that gentleness is defined literally in that word from the Greek. Because it's not just, having a polite, mild manner. It's actually more than that. Spirit-produced gentleness is a confident and committed acceptance. It's accepting what is happening around you and even to you, even if you don't like it. But at the same time, being confident that God is there to help, and then committed to Him in the ways that He says that you're still going to follow Him. And of course, the perfect example of that was Jesus. In fact, Jesus is described like that with that same word. Gentle and riding on a donkey, on the colt of a donkey, Zechariah. That same word is used for Jesus. Jesus accepted His Father's will. Even though the Jews, and even though His own disciples said, no, it can't be like that. Jesus said, it is. That's the way I'm doing things. And He was, of course, confident that this is the way that God was going to bring things about in the way that they needed to be. And He was committed to that. He set His face like flint. He went without any questioning or challenging. And since Jesus was like that perfect for us, we're forgiven when we're not. And He also instills that, gives that to you and me as Christians, as He lives in us and gives us that fruit of faith. And so, take a look at the way that Daniel lived that out. In fact, I'm going to ask you the question, in what ways did Daniel's request not to eat the forbidden foods? Because he goes on to say, not going to eat them. Or he says, is it possible for me not to? A little bit of a difference there. So in what ways did Daniel's request not to eat forbidden foods show this confident and committed acceptance, right? So, try to pull that out of these verses. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So he doesn't even go to the top. He asks that person who's right over him, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. And treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. By 10 days doesn't sound like a lot. to look better, how can you know? Sometimes it takes longer than that to get what your COVID test back. Maybe not anymore, but back in March and April, it might have taken that long. But all that Daniel asked for is 10 days. How does that possibly show that acceptance? If it's going to be, it's going to be the way that the guard says, okay, and also God's way. How does that show confidence? 10 days? God can make it happen, right? Anything else that you see in Daniel's request that shows his acceptance? Yeah.
Maybe something that we can apply from this too is a way, sometimes we think about Old Testament believers like they were legalists, meaning all they did was just follow rule after rule. But if you look at it, you would have made all kinds of decisions on a daily basis where you wouldn't have taken into account the spirit of the law. If you think of in the exile, they would have had to do the same thing. They couldn't go back for the Passover. There was nowhere to go. So they had to figure out a way to observe the Sabbath day. They had to figure out a way to do that. That's where the synagogues came up. And I think you get to see here that Daniel adjusting, keeping respect for the Word of God, but then also dealing with the reality of where he was and how do you find that place. And as New Testament Christians, we do the same thing, right? Well, what's our current situation? How do we live according to God's will?
Yeah, Daniel could have said, well, can't do it. We're going to follow God's law to the letter, and we can't serve in this setting. Daniel is saying, God has put us into this new setting. God delivered us into this new normal. Let's live with it. In fact, that's what Jeremiah had been telling him. Live. prosper, do God's will in your new normal. That was tough, and yet Daniel was finding a way. But what? Still in the ways that God said, in a committed, accepting way that continued to be confident of God's blessing. Boy, if God can do this, he can do it in no time flat. But he even agreed, or he said, treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So they find out before, what if they got acting? What if they looked worse? What was he saying? I accept that too. I'm committed to God. I'm going to accept whatever God allows to happen. That's great trust. That's great acceptance that only God can do. You read on in that passage in Philippians 4, after what we had just read before, in verse 5, let your gentleness be evident to all, that confident, committed acceptance, the Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. 14, from this passage, pick out other qualities of confident and committed acceptance for pressure-packed situations. What does the acceptance that God gives to us lead us to do, according to this passage? When we maybe don't like the situation that we're in, the new normal that we're dealing with. It was mentioned before, of course, to pray, even to give thanks. What else? What is verse 7 about? A peace of God going past one's normal understanding and actually standing guard. How could that help you in a new job where you're being pressured maybe to do some things that you really can't do? Yeah.
You can kind of like just find peace in knowing God as a reason why you have to do these things. Just to like trust in Him.
Yeah. Trust in Him and talk it over with Him, right? And go to Him in prayer and present those challenges. I'm sure like Daniel was probably doing during those 10 days. But then like you said, what? Trusting, right? That's where the peace comes in. Daniel's peace was, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I don't understand it, but God's got it. God's going to guard me in my faith, and God's going to guard me in this new normal. To go with Him, not to go away from Him. And really that peace goes back to what? If I mess up, if I'm doing this in the wrong way, how can I be sure that God is blessing me then? Peace of God is knowing that you're forgiven. God has to be part of you. You leave the communion table, you leave the service every week with the peace of God. You're forgiven. God is for you. God is working all things out for your good. Boy, is that ever confident building? Does that ever give you peace? A calm confidence in whatever happens. That's what was Daniel's, and actually that's really what's ours. You know, you could say, we're not like that. You know, especially when maybe we're facing a life change, right? And often there's that sinful part of us that isn't so accepting and isn't so trusting, but actually it is a special gift from God. When you look at that, Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit's on the tree. That gentleness is in you. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. There it is. Gentleness. this confident, committed acceptance that God gives to you as you continue to go to Him and as He continues to come to you with His promises and with His power and with His working everything out. And finally, that's the miraculous way that God worked things out for Daniel. This has been described as another period of miracles in the history of God's Old Testament people. You can think of what? The time of the Exodus? Miracle after miracle. God parting the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho toppling, right? There was the conquest of Judah. There were times when, the times of the prophets, Elisha and Elijah, people being raised from the dead. Here's another time when God's people are not even in their country, even when it seems like things have completely changed. No kings. Where's the Messiah going to come from? No problem. God's still with His people working His miracles of deliverance. Know what some of those are. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. They didn't have to worry about acne. In fact, they were remarkably better. That they had this new look that was noticeable. Just from the water that probably wasn't the most healthy, and from those vegetables. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. And they kept getting better. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So imagine going to bed at night and not being able to figure out a problem and getting up the next day and, boy, this calculus is a breeze. That's what it was like for Daniel and his companions. God just gifted them with that knowledge. And people around them are going, where are these guys getting this from? And then Daniel was even able to understand the visions and the dreams. God gave more of those and helped people know His will with the proper interpretation like a prophet. Daniel, if he wasn't a prophet before this, was given that gift of prophecy at this point. And that was apparent when he was interviewed by King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, the king talked with them, found none equal to Daniel and those other companions. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. There you see the name, magicians, the magi. They were the wise men that King Nebuchadnezzar was selecting, the brightest and best of the brightest and the best to be part of his cabinet. And here were men from God's nation, blessed by God, who stood out in these roles. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So he was like that for the next 70 years. A closing point. Why could you agree? We as Christians today are blessed with powerful influence when we show confident and committed acceptance of new and difficult situations. Can you think of how you and I would be powerful influencers by the acceptance that God works in you and me? Some of those older folks that just won't accept the changes that they're being forced to live with. When they're reminded that God is still with them, God forgives them for their stubbornness, that God has worked things out for them in the past, that's a powerful influence, right? It brings them to accept that. Just like it often is for us to hear it from them. You talk to some of the folks who lost so much during this time, and they'll talk about how difficult it is, and yet how the Lord continues to be with them, and how they pore over His Word and His promises in His devotions and in the mailings and the way that they're able to follow His Word. And it's simply remarkable and miraculous that they have that confident, committed acceptance of what they're going through. And I think that's probably been seen in you and me too. You know, you see some of the difficulty in dealing with things, and sometimes the instability, the reactions, even in an unaccepting and an angry way. And sometimes that comes out of us because we're sinful. And yet we are the people with God's promises and God Himself that has that acceptance that sometimes we just have to be marveling of, but also of how it's really making a bright light and being a preserving salt for the people around us. Let's pray. Lord, help us to see in Daniel what you work in us. In spite of the difficult and even the ways that our faith is tested by dramatically different and sometimes unacceptable things that are happening to us and to people that we love. Maybe even things that face our nation. Help us to see that you continue to be there for us with faith and forgiveness, and that you continue to work in us in acceptance of all things because you are with us. You are bringing them to be for our favor. Finally, for us to be with you and for you to be with us. And for us, in the end, finally to be brought to the promised land, even as Daniel and his companions were. Even though they didn't necessarily return from exile, they were able to return in the way that you kept them close and brought them to your home in heaven. Help us to see that waiting. Help us to see that acceptance finally being founded in what you have waiting for us as our Lord and Savior and righteous Judge. Amen. Daniel chapter 2 next week. Thanks for joining us. Oh. They gave their